So we're going to go ahead and start the recording now. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. Our series is Practical Applications of Systems to Conduct Evaluation, Cases and Examples. Our series is co-hosted by myself, Danielle Varda. I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Denver in the School of Public Affairs, and Johnny Morrell, who's a Director of Evaluation at Fulcrum Corporation. We are thrilled that everyone is joining our call. As you know, this is the second of 6 webinars that we're hosting on systems evaluation. We are thrilled that we've had 6 people volunteer to do these evaluations. I'm happy today to introduce our presenter, Johnny Morrell. Johnny is going today to talk on the topic of cross-boundary insights, plans, critical incidents, and outcomes, or as he has as a subtitle, Johnny's latest favorite way of applying some complexity ideas in evaluation. Here's his contact information if you want to contact him after the webinar. A little bit about Johnny. He is Director of Evaluation at Fulcrum Corporation, Editor-in-Chief of Evaluation and Program Planning. He's the author of Evaluation in the Face of Uncertainty, Anticipating Surprise and Responding to the Inevitable. If you want to follow Johnny, he has a terrific blog at Surprises and Programs and Their Evaluations. And again, there's his website, jamorrell.com. So we're really fortunate today to be able to have him participate as our speaker. We're going to ask Johnny to go ahead and talk for about 18 minutes. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A section. And then once Johnny's done, I'm going to go ahead and field those questions, and we'll spend the last few minutes of the webinar answering them. So without any other hesitation, let's go ahead and have Johnny start.
Let's make sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, first of all, let me give you a little bit of context. The evaluation I'm going to talk about is, as I like to say, a work in progress, and I can't give you any details of exactly what the program is or who I'm doing it for or where I'm doing it, but I can assure you it's based on some real work that I'm doing. On the other hand, the example I'm going to give you is a synthetic example. One of the things I find when I use examples is that real-world examples usually don't allow me to provide all of the details that I want. So I take examples that I base on my real work, and then I elaborate them so I can make the points that I want to make. The program that I'm dealing with is a program having to do with distracted driving or use of electronic devices during transportation activities. I can't even tell you which transportation activities, because that would imply sort of understanding the modality and sort of where I'm doing this evaluation. What you're going to see here actually started as a simple exercise in looking at timelines, but I always tend to look at the world in terms of complex behavior, and it evolved from there. So let me go through this. This entire presentation, by the way, only has 2 slides to it, and hopefully they are rich enough that I can tell you the story. So that's what I'm going to do. I started out with these 2 swim lanes down here, right? There's a project plan and there's an actual project plan. Then as I thought about it, I put in some other swim lanes. I said, okay, we can look at critical incidents that take place during the course of the project. We can look at desirable consequences, and we can look at undesirable consequences. And you'll notice I color-coded the consequences. Black are things that you might anticipate, and this sort of purple color are things that you couldn't anticipate. Now you'll notice that the project plan and the critical incidents and the undesirable, they're green. And the reason they're green is that I'm a great believer in thinking about where the uncertainty in the world comes from. And I basically decided, based on my experience, that when it comes to project plans and desirable consequences, those are pretty straightforward, although you can have some unexpected desirable consequences. But in general, I think they're pretty straightforward. Whereas with project plans and critical incidents and undesirable consequences, that's really where I see most of the uncertainty coming in. And one of the things I've believed, because it's a complex world, that you get some interesting interactions amongst these swim lanes, and understanding those interactions is what you need to be able to understand programs. So the way I began this is by looking at the actual plan and the project plan. Now, we all know that things never go according to plan, and sure enough, they were going to choose a site down here in February. The site didn't get chosen here till about March or April. They were going to do small-scale testing. That got delayed. They were going to implement a program which had to do with job aids and training and peer communication. That didn't happen till here. Now, the truth of the matter is that we all know that this is true, that the plans never work out. But it turns out there are some pretty good reasons for it. One reason is psychological, right? Is that human beings are fairly optimistic people, and we always overstate our abilities and understate our ability to understand the world. And there's a whole lot of interesting psychology behind that. But the other reason is that, in fact, the world is a complex system. And what that means is that no matter how smart we are, we're never going to be able to anticipate all of the problems that are going to get in the way of getting a project implemented. And because that's true, you're always going to see those delays. Now, by the way, a lot of people, when it comes to project management, take a statistical view, which is to say, let's not look at what we think is going to happen. Let's look at programs like this and see how long they take in terms of size, complexity, etc. But if you don't do that, you're really going to run into this kind of trouble because, as I said, there is some complexity here. Now, one of the issues is understanding the difference, the reason for these kinds of lags. Now, on the one hand, as I said, those kinds of lags are inevitable, right, because of the sort of complexity of the world. But I also have a sense that you can look at this the way people look at accidents. I do a lot of evaluation research on accidents. And there are two ways to look at accidents. One is as what they call a normal accident, which actually implies that it's a complex system and you will always have problems. But the other is to say, be that as it may, let's just pick off the problems one by one. And if we pick off those problems one by one, we will eventually be able to make things safer. And that's the way I look at this issue of project planning, which is that if we can understand the reasons why there are these kinds of delays, even though we can never completely solve them, as we pick them off one by one, we're ultimately going to be better off. And the way I do that is by looking at these critical incidents. Now, these critical incidents either come from my observing of what's going on, or my team's observing, or the interviewing that we're doing, but things happen. Now, by the way, I have a lot of reasons to believe that only looking at critical incidents are not going to be a sufficient explanation for why you get these kinds of delays. But let's leave that alone for the moment. What you can do is look at these kinds of things, and these critical incidents are things that, for the most part, were not anticipated when the program was implemented. Nobody assumed there'd be a labor dispute over participation, but there was, right? And as a result, they were going to choose a site down here. They ended up choosing a site here, so there was a reason, there was a delay there, right? So you can begin to look at critical incidents and try to understand some of the relationships between these unexpected critical incidents and the reason for these delays. And by the way, in the real world, this issue of the surge in business and the new hire training, those also had a variety of implications, but this picture would get too complicated, so I decided to leave that out. The other thing that I've realized is that you can understand relationships across what I like to call these swim lanes. So if you think of the example here, this publicity campaign was always planned. Now, it's true that it came a little bit late, okay? But they did, in fact, have this publicity campaign. Well, what happened? Well, one of the things that happened is what they expected, right? Which is that within this workplace, because of the publicity campaign, communication amongst the workforce and safety culture improved. Safety culture basically has to do with sort of what is the culture in an organization around issues of safety. And there's a whole interesting research literature on that question. So that's the good news, right? The good news is that they implemented this publicity campaign, and in fact, safety culture improved. Right? The problem, though, is that safety culture is invisible to the public. Right? What the public sees is whether or not there's improved safety. Right? Fewer crashes, fewer people getting hurt, etc. Well, the problem here is that this communication is invisible to the public, and yet the publicity campaign raised the public profile of what was going on, right? And so that is a reason why one might expect that there is this adverse public reaction because the improved safety hasn't happened yet. And so that's sort of the way that you can explain these things. If you look at implementing job aids, right, that in fact affected communication, and it will in fact affect, in theory, improved safety, right? But we have a problem. The problem is that there were unexpected delays here in implementing this program, right? If they had implemented it here in January, it's not inconceivable you might have in fact seen some safety improvements a year later in December. But they were unable to do it, right? Some of the uncertainty here was such that, yes, it should affect safety, but look at this, there's not enough time to do it, right? So what I'm basically doing is looking at the levels of uncertainty here and trying to understand where things go with these swim lanes, and using critical incidents as one of the ways to understand what's happening. By the way, you'll notice I have undesirable consequences up here. This is both purple and black, and the reason is that I actually couldn't make up my own mind when I worked out this example whether this is something that one should have expected or not. This labor dispute, no question, nobody could have anticipated that. This one, I have to admit, I'm a little bit back and forth on in my own mind. The real issue here is why I look at undesirable consequences. And my belief is that you need to look at them because they will almost always be there. And my perspective is that they will almost always be there because of my sense of the complexity in the world. And I tend to think of programs in terms of evolutionary biology. I think of programs as sort of efforts at improvement that are kind of like organisms that are climbing a fitness landscape and trying to improve their ecological niche. And if you think of it that way, they're going to disturb the neighbors, right? And so there's always going to be a little bit of pushback. Now, it's true if you think of it in these terms that you can actually think of symbiotic relationships. But what I believe is that for the most part, when things begin to change, the organisms and the environment around you are going to push back. And so I always believe there are going to be some undesirable consequences. Now a lot of people sort of have criticized me and said, well, Johnny, that's kind of just your personality. If there are going to be unexpected consequences, why do you think they necessarily have to be undesirable? I guess my belief is that at least in the short term, there are always going to be undesirable consequences. If you want to make something of that in terms of my personality instead of my sense of evolutionary biology, that would be okay. And by the way, when I do these evaluations, I tend not to talk about this very much because it is very unpopular. People don't like to hear about the fact that no matter how good they think their program is, something undesirable is going to happen. My general belief in these things is that that's okay. I mean, the real issue is whether the net value is worth having, not whether something bad is going to happen as a result. But anyway, so because of my sense of programs as evolving on fitness landscapes, I always tend to have undesirable consequences, at least in my back pocket if I don't talk to people about it, but it's always something to think about. So as I said, this is how I tend to look at these things. What I try to do is to pinpoint the domains or the streamlines where there might be uncertainty, because that has to do with issues of how you monitor your evaluation. Methodologies have to be somewhat different. And then I find it very useful to try to explain programs by trying to figure out what are the reasons for these these discrepancies between the plan and the actual, because there are often systematic reasons for it. Like, so for instance, here, right, we know perfectly well what the problem is, right? If we look at this adverse public reaction, we can understand that by saying, they're succeeding here in their publicity campaign. That is having some beneficial effects up here, but look at the relationship between this outcome, which is invisible to the public, this outcome, which ultimately will be visible to the public, and the fact that down here, we actually have a part of our program that's going to affect what's going on up here. So as I said, I find it an extremely useful way of looking at the world. Now, I got another 2 or 3 minutes, so let me talk a little bit about the next slide here. This is what the program really looked like. Now, you'll notice it says some real but obscure data. I still cannot tell you exactly what this program was or who was involved in it. But this is really what happened. The program was supposed to start in September 2012. That's when the contract was awarded. It actually didn't start until April 2014. And you'll notice down here, training classes began. These training classes were actually the guts of beginning some kind of an intervention that might affect people. Right? So you'll notice the original plan was 12 months. The new plan was 12 months, but it didn't happen for more than another 2 years. Right? And then within this 12-month time frame, training began up around, I don't know, let's say October, which means that there was a relatively small amount of time that would allow these classes to have an effect. And in fact, if you look at the previous slide, that's what happened here, right? You implemented this thing late enough that now it became unreasonable to think that you were going to get the kinds of safety improvements that you wanted to get. Let's see. Evaluating this part of the project life cycle required a completely unplanned methodology. That is true. When I originally set this up, I had this really cool methodology to look at all this blue stuff. I had interviews, and I had quantitative data, and I had, time, change over time, and all that wonderful stuff. It turned out, though, that what I needed to do to evaluate the reasons for this were really quite different. And it turns out that there are 2 separate methodologies I needed, because what was going on here within the organization turned out to be quite different than what was going on here. Here it says permission to proceed. That permission came from the sponsor, and it took a long time for them to agree with it as a result of the problem that we had here. Ask for approval for time B. So again, you can see what I'm trying to do here is to use the timeline to figure out where the uncertainty is, and then try to use the critical incidents to understand, let's go back for a minute, use the critical incidents to understand why we have these kinds of discrepancies, and then to use all 3 of these swim lanes to understand both the desirable and the undesirable consequences. So let's see, I'm about 12:20, right? So I need to shut up and take questions, or can I spend some more time talking about this, Danielle?
Why don't you go ahead and just spend like 1 or 2 minutes closing out, and then we'll do questions.
1 or 2 minutes closing out, okay.
Yeah. Unless you're done, we've got a few questions ready.
All right, well, the 1 or 2 minutes closing out, I have to say that I'd like to say that this whole methodology popped into my head whole cloth, and it's not true. I basically started out with an idle thought, which is, if I'm going to explain this program, I should take a look at the project plan, I should take a look at the actual plan, I should begin to look at discrepancies, which seemed pretty straightforward and quite instrumental. Once that happened, I began to filter that through the way I tend to look at the world. And the way I tend to look at the world has to do with this notion of the world being a complex system. That's where I came up with this notion, excuse me, of why there are undesirable consequences, why I came up with this notion that critical incidents, at least some of them, cannot be predicted in the future, and sort of thinking about this whole issue of normal accidents, which is basically an accident embedded in a complex system, and thinking about how people actually improve safety, I began to understand that you do need to look at this in systems terms, but you can also say we can improve how people manage programs by looking at problem number 1, problem number 2, problem number 3, and making people sensitive to that. So that is, I guess, whoops, sorry about that. Next. Right, and so that's really where things are. The one last thing I would say is that I actually think this is fractal, in a sense, by which I mean, oh, phooey, sorry about that. By which I mean that these kinds of delays, no matter what the scale, are going to be the same. I can't prove it, but I think it's true for theoretical reasons, that these kinds of unpredictable gaps are going to be recognizable across the entire life cycle of a program, recognizable as in terms of the same pattern here, recognizable in terms of the same pattern here. And if I were to actually break this down to look at the mini and micro level events that are affecting what's going on, I bet you'd see the same pattern of long and short delays going on. And I actually do use that a lot when I evaluate programs, because I have a sense that there is this similarity in the pattern of long and short delays, no matter what the time scale, which is another nice complexity idea that I use a lot in my own work. Have I used up enough time and I should answer questions now?
Yep, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Johnny. Let's go ahead and start with a few that are already queued up. If you have more questions, just go ahead and put them in. We'll answer as many as we can. So the first question for you is, what strategies have you used to work with people to help them document critical incidents or even identify them?
Well, in this particular project, it's pretty straightforward. I have a principle of data collection, especially when it comes to interviewing or talking to people. My principle is that collecting a little bit of data on a regular basis is a lot better off than trying to collect a lot of data on an irregular basis. And if you don't have in-depth information, that's okay. Because if you think that there's something going on, you can always do a deep dive. So what I did was this project, and I use this with other projects as well, but this project actually has a steering committee. It has 5 or 6 people at the work site who are implementing this program. So what I do is I talk to them once a week, right? There are 6 people on this committee. Every week on Monday, we pick one of them, and I spend 15 minutes on the phone with them, right? And that's a very simple, what's been going on? Has anything happened that's affected this program in the last week or two? Do you expect anything coming up that might affect this in the next week or two? So that kind of very short interviewing helps. It's also true that I have very good connections with the corporate sponsor, and I talk to the corporate sponsor a lot, and I have very good connections with the process consultant who's working with them. And so I do that too, right? I just plain every month or so with those folks, I have a short conversation, what's going on. And then frankly, I know this industry very well, right? And there's the reading of the New York Times, and there's understanding what's happening in the industry, and that works as well. It's not fancy, it's asking simple questions and keeping my ears open.
Nice. Okay, how do you know where to draw the arrows between the swim lanes? How do you know that there is causality and the undesirable consequences are not caused by other outside factors?
Those are two separate questions.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
All right, one question is how to draw the arrows. Okay, and that really comes from looking at the data and understanding what's going on. Okay, and that's data analysis. I don't mean math. That's data interpretation, right? Whether it's qualitative data or quantitative data, you use the data to understand what's happening. And some of that is the data, and some of that is theory, and some of it is common sense, and so on. Now, in terms of what's going on here, you could actually ask that question for the desirable consequences as well. Maybe none of this stuff is having any kind of an effect, and it's all the outside world. And that, in fact, may be true. If you think, for instance, of things like distracted driving, there's a tremendous amount of publicity out there in the world about that. So for all we know, this publicity campaign and job and stuff has zero effect, and you'd still see changes here. And the answer is that there are aspects of this methodology that are not contained in just looking at the swim lanes, right? I didn't talk about monitoring the environment. I didn't talk about control groups. And there are all kinds of things that you can look at outside this particular way of looking at the world, and you should.
Okay. How do you sell this to the evaluation client, given there's often a resistance to anything that smells like complexity, and their reaction might be, "Thank you, Johnny, but did it reach the output?"
That's easy. I don't tell them. I'm not kidding about that. Okay. The fact of the matter is that thinking about complexity, how should I put this? I never use these kind of esoteric, highfalutin concepts with people unless I know them well and we're drinking at the bar. Right? If you think about this, you don't need to talk about any of that. You can sit down with a client and you can say, We're going to look at discrepancies between the real plan and the actual plan. They'll nod their heads and say, yeah, that makes sense. You could say, we're going to interview people and do project monitoring to see if there were critical incidents. And they're going to say, yep, that makes sense. The only thing I might not want to talk to them about is this top swim lane up here. We're going to look at desirable consequences. We're going to do interviewing. We have a control group. We're going to look at the quantitative data on accident rates. We're going to, whatever it might be. And they're all going to nod their heads and say, that makes sense. The fact that my conceptualization of this thing and my data interpretation is informed by my understanding of complex behavior is irrelevant to them. What they care about is what I found out. Now, once I get to know them well, I might sneak some of that stuff in. But you need to be able to think in complex terms. You don't need to be able to talk in complex terms to be able to do this kind of work. So I wasn't kidding. I don't tell them.
Nice.
Any more questions? That was easy. Any more questions?
Yeah, just a couple more. So for the labor dispute example, while being undesirable, it was unclear why it was included to be a consequence of the program. So the question is, can you please explain what gets included a little bit more?
Oh, sure. The reason this was this counted as a consequence, and by the way, notice it shows up twice, right? Because it is in fact a critical incident, but it's also, as far as I'm concerned, an undesirable outcome. If somebody wanted to say that doesn't really count as an outcome, it's simply a critical incident, I wouldn't get into a big argument with you. But I do think it belongs here. And the reason is, and I don't have Visio up here, I'd show you, but the truth of the matter is that if this program may be thought of in terms of a kickoff or maybe the project plan, right? It's the project plan and the kickoff, those were interventions in this site. And it's that change, it's the implementation of that change that made this happen. Right. Otherwise, if you didn't ask people to participate, you wouldn't have had that kind of pushback. So as I said, if I had more time, I'd call up Visio and do it. But what I would do is I would take an arrow and I'd connect it from somewhere around here, project plan, kickoff, sort of project initiation stuff. And I would draw the arrow right up to there because it was this change here that resulted in what went on here. And that's why I put it up here as well as down here. If somebody wanted to argue that point with me, I wouldn't give them a big argument.
Okay, we just have two more, and let's go ahead and try to answer them.
Sure.
Do you think capacity building for internal evaluation would be more open to the undesirable consequences swim lane?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot that people talk about evaluation capacity. And my view of evaluation capacity is that organizations and people in the organizations should follow the tagline in my email. Right? And the tagline in my email says, respect data, trust judgment. Right? If people do that, they're going to be all right. My suspicion is that this is always going to be unpleasant. Don't forget that people want rational information. On the other hand, they're likely not to have hired you unless they really believe that what they were doing was the right thing. And they might, on some intellectual level, believe, yes, there are some undesirable consequences, but the overall value, is worth doing anyway. These things are really big deals. On the other hand, they're beholden to someone, right? And getting too public about this, maybe it's my personality again, but I don't see that as ever being something people are going to look at or want to look at, although I do believe that if you did an evaluation by including all relevant stakeholders, you would in fact find stakeholders who were opposed to the program, and if they put a logic model together and you included them, that program theory, that logic model would in fact include all this stuff. But none of us do business that way. We maybe should, but we don't.
So we are just getting to the end, but there's just two quick things here, and I think if it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and cover them. This one is just covering, someone joined late, and so they wanted to just hear again how you define critical incident. The
way I define a critical incident, I say to people, what has happened or what is likely to happen, depending on who I'm talking to, that you really think is going to have an effect on this program for better or for worse. And I change that wording, depending on who I'm talking to. But I have them look back into the recent past. I have them look into the future. I orient them around. It could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. And these are all people that are intimately involved in what's going on, by the way. So they know these things, right? And I ask them. Now, that's one of the problems, is that someone asked about, well, maybe things are going on in the environment. Just trusting your respondents on what the critical incidents are is a really dangerous thing to do, because there could be other things going on. But this is a good way to go about it as a first shot.
Okay, and this is the last one. This is a little bit more of a comment, so I think
Sure.
we're looking for your reaction. The comment is, this must also apply in the political realm where outcomes are never as planned.
Say that
There's
one.
no question. This one's just looking for your reaction. This must also apply in the political realm where outcomes are never as planned.
Well, I'm not sure that that's a political question. It is true that outcomes are never as planned, and the fact is that that's why this is not an entire evaluation methodology. Because the fact of the matter is, first of all, anything undesirable, well, some of these are unplanned, but obviously that's true. Lots of programs have desirable unplanned consequences. I'm in favor, listen to what you're talking about. I wrote a whole book on that subject. So obviously I think that that's true. And so a real complete evaluation plan would really take a good look at how these things develop. And in fact, as unplanned consequences pop up, they actually do need to be plugged in here. And whether you have a methodology that can explain them or not is a whole separate question. I don't advocate this as a self-contained methodology, only as a good way to look at the programs you're evaluating, as long as you're doing all the other important stuff as well.
Terrific. Okay, well, Johnny, thank you so much for your time today. That was terrific.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for joining. We have people on the phone from all over the world, and so we just want to say hello to everyone, and thanks for participating. As a reminder, for each webinar, you'll have to register for separately. And so on the website, there is a link to register for the next upcoming webinar. So we will send out, if you're on our email alert list, which you can also sign up for on the webinar, on the website, we will send out a note, an invitation to you that says, here's the link to register. So,
hey, Danielle, before people sign off, one more thing.
Yeah.
We are looking for nominations for more presentations. All right, we've got 6 all told queued up. If anybody out there has ideas for topics or ideas for people, you know where to find us. I got to put that plug in.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's been great. Johnny and I have had a little trial and error for getting this off the ground, but I think it's a little bit more smooth sailing now. So, and we'll have this recorded, so if you want to find it online, it's also on the website. Thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a terrific rest of the week.
Yep, take care. Thank you all for listening
Bye-bye.
to me. I appreciate it.